you guys, Flickers of Fear time once again. If you hear some weird noises in the background, it's like wind outside. For some reason, it's like really, really windy. I don't know why, but so sometimes you can hear it. So if you can hear it, that's what that is. So today, let's talk about this fairly recent movie right here. So now, back when we used to have our AMC Stubs membership, which we actually pretty recently canceled, mostly because, well, two reasons, because I couldn't really afford it anymore, and we moved much farther away from the movie theater, so we found that we were never going, so we were essentially paying for nothing. It was kind of a shame, because I did like to go to the movies, but, you know, it's just too far to drive, and I couldn't justify paying that much money when usually you just have to wait a couple weeks, and then the movie will turn up on VOD anyway. But back when we were still going to the movies, I swear to God, every single time we went to the theater, I saw the trailer for The Black Phone. Every fucking time, I kind of feel like. I saw it so many times. So I feel like the movie was teased forever. And then, like, it just didn't come out. And I'm like, what the hell is going on with that stuff? What ended up happening with it, like, I looked it up later. I guess it was first scheduled for wide release back in like late January of 2022, but then it got pushed back to February, and then it got pushed back to like June 24th. So I think that's when it finally came out, like in summer of 2022. So I think that's probably why I had the perception that it was like never coming out, because probably we had been going to the movies like in late 2021 and they were probably like hyping it then. And then I was just like, where the fuck is this movie? Like, it never came out. So when it finally did come out, by the time summer of 2022 came around, you know, we'd already moved out here. We weren't really going to the theater all that often. So, you know, we just never got around to seeing it. So then I kind of like forgot about it until the other day when I was scrolling through Amazon Prime and I was like, oh, hey, they added it to streaming. I think it was actually on Peacock before that, but you know, which I do check sometimes, but I hadn't checked it for whatever reason. But I did see it on Amazon Prime because I do have a membership to that. So I was like, ooh, I was like kind of excited about it because honestly, the trailer for this looked pretty good. And it's like, usually I like Blumhouse and I like Ethan Hawke, and you know, it just looked like a cool concept, so I was excited to watch it. So as I said, this is a Blumhouse production. They were they were the releasing company on it, and it was directed by Scott Derrickson, who is the man responsible for the quite excellent horror films Sinister and The Exorcism of Emily Rose. I think he also did the first Doctor Strange movie in 2016, and I think he was also supposed to do the second one, like the Multiverse of Madness or whatever, but like he left because of creative differences. So he went and like worked on this one, which actually is cool because this seems like more in his wheelhouse, I guess. I haven't seen Doctor Strange. I don't know if it's good. Like, the Marvel movies are fine. I'm just like not a real big Marvel person, or I don't really like big tentpole movies kind of thing. So anyway, I really like that he kind of went back to like a more indie horror type situation. So The Black Phone was actually based on a 2004 short story by Joe Hill, who, as pretty much everybody that's watching this probably knows, is Stephen King's son, as well as a best-selling author in his own right. So I will say that The Black Phone does have something of veneer of what you might call Stephen Kinginess, you know what I mean? Like, you got, you know, abusive alcoholic dad, you got like a bunch of bullying, like, you know, boys bullying each other, kids with psychic powers, that kind of stuff. But it also kind of also has its own thing going on. And I have to say that I really liked the whole downbeat 1970s vibe of it. I think that was one of my favorite things about it. Now, I will say that the trailer, if you've seen it, and like I said, if you went to the movies at all, like in late 2021 or early 2022, it was very, very hard to avoid because they showed it all the time. But I feel like it gave a lot of the story away. So if you saw the trailer, it's not going to be like super, super surprising. I think there is more depth to the movie than what it showed in the trailer, but the movie's pretty straightforward, which actually was another thing that I kind of liked about it. It wasn't all that complicated. Like, it was a pretty simple story. It was a pretty straightforward story, but it was done well, and it was like had some depth and layers to it, but nothing too abstract or nothing like that. So I'm going to say that even though the trailer kind of shows how the movie goes, essentially, I don't think the movie overall like suffered as a result of that. I mean, because while the movie isn't really, it's not like a masterpiece or anything like that, but as I said, it does have a lot more interesting layers to it and a better thought out structure to it than maybe a lot of other mainstream horror movies do. It also went a little bit darker thematically, I think, than I was expecting, just in terms of showing child abuse and bullying in like a really grounded and very, very realistic kind of way, so much so that it was kind of like uncomfortable to watch. So I feel like Ethan Hawke got most of the marketing attention around this movie, I guess. Like, it's his face on the poster, he's the bad guy, and it was kind of like a big deal because I think prior to this he'd had kind of a rule where he didn't play villains. So I think, as far as I know, this might be the first movie where he played an out-and-out villain, like a child killer. So I do feel like he got most of the marketing thing because he's the biggest star, obviously. But I mean, and I'm not going to complain too much about that because his performance in this movie is pretty great. But the story here really belongs to the kid characters and focuses more on their struggles. Like, Ethan Hawke's villain, like the child killer, doesn't really have as much screen time as they do, and he doesn't even really feature in the story like to any significant degree until about 40 minutes in or so, like maybe about halfway. I mean, and this is a horror movie, sure, but to be honest, I kind of feel like it's more properly classified as maybe like a thriller or maybe like a dark coming of age drama with horror and supernatural elements, because there is supernatural elements in it. It does have horror elements in it, but I don't know if I'd call it like an out and out horror film. But again, that's kind of one of the things that I liked about it. So like, don't go into this expecting it to be like a straight up slasher flick or anything like that. One review of it I read called it Silence of the Lambs meets The Sixth Sense, which it's not a perfect comparison, but it's definitely in that same ballpark, you know what I mean? So the story is set in Denver, Colorado in 1978. And it centers mostly around a boy named Finney Blake, who's played by Mason Thames, I guess is how you pronounce his last name, even though I always want to say Thames, because that's how the river is spelled. He has a younger sister named Gwen, who's played by Madeline McGraw, and their abusive father, whose name is Terrence, who's played by Jeremy Davies. Now, the dad, like, his alcoholism and violence toward his kids have seemed to, like, it's only increased since his wife committed suicide sometime before. I don't think they specify how long ago it was, but I'm assuming it's fairly recent. So as if the kids don't have it bad enough, like getting their asses horribly beaten at home, they're also the target of bullies at school. And because this movie is set in the 1970s, the bullying here, like, does absolutely go there. I mean, these kids, like, beat the absolute shit out of each other, and nobody does anything about it. Like, I kind of feel like nowadays, if kids were fighting like that, like, somebody would intervene, you know what I mean? Like, the parents or school authorities or cops or somebody like that, but nobody does. Like, it just seems like, and that's kind of, I mean, I was alive in 1978, so that totally does track. They were just kind of like, the kids, they just fight their own battles, you know what I mean? And it's just that kind of shit. So nobody does anything about it, and these kids are, like, actually beating the shit out of each other. Now, Finney is kind of friends with this sort of tough kid whose name is Robin, and at one point, Robin, like, pummels this asshole older kid. Like, you don't really care because the kid is a jerk, so that you're just kind of like, yeah, beat his ass, whatever. But he just, like, pummels this asshole kid into unconsciousness and then just keeps on beating for good. I'm like, oh my God, is he gonna beat him to death? It was like that. And these are kids, you know what I mean? They're probably like, 12, 13, I don't know. I couldn't tell how old they were. You know what I mean? And Robin doesn't get any trouble for this either, not that I remember, like, in the movie. And matter of fact, he tells Finney, like, not long after this incident, like, Finney's just kind of like, bro, like, he was very uncomfortable with how far that fight went. He's like, I thought you were going to kill him. He basically says, well, you're eventually going to have to learn to stand up for yourself and for others. And he basically says sometimes when it comes to bullies, like, you have to draw a lot of blood in order to make an impression. So these themes of, like, savagery and cycles of abuse, I mean, it's pretty prevalent throughout the whole movie. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's heavy-handed, but it's definitely not subtle. I mean, it's established, like, almost from the beginning that Finney's character arc is going to involve him having to fight for survival and learn to ultimately stand up for himself, not only by defeating the main villain, the child killer, but also by breaking the cycle of abuse that's been engendered by his father's treatment of him and his sister. So in the area where Finney lives, there's an elusive killer who has been nicknamed the Grabber, and he's been snatching boys off the street. And just as would have happened in 1978, like when you didn't have the internet and like creepy shit like this was going on, a bunch of urban legends have started to spring up about this killer, like including ones that are kind of more supernatural in nature. Like there's one point where they say it's like, oh, if you say his name, like he can hear you and he'll like come after you next and stuff like that. So while there is supernatural stuff going on in this movie, though, it's never really made clear if the killer has any kind of abilities in that direction. I'm thinking probably no, but the victims, or at least Finney and his sister, absolutely do. Matter of fact, Finney's sister Gwen has dreams that are kind of like visions, you know what I mean? Psychic visions. And ever since the abduction started, she's been having these kind of disjointed nightmares that seem to provide clues about some of the cases. Now, because she told the sister of one of the kidnapped boys that she dreamed about, she's like, hey, I dreamed about your brother, and she saw some black balloons. So the police actually come to school to question her because the black balloons thing, like that detail, was something they had not released to the public, so they can't figure out how she knows about it. So the cops actually don't believe her about her dreams, and they're kind of wondering if she might know more about the crimes that she's letting on, but she claps back at them like pretty harshly. She's just like, oh my God, can you really think that me, a little girl, I'm just like, yeah, I'm the killer. You know what I mean? She's like, I have dreams, you know what I mean? Fuck off. It's really, really funny. Like, actually, she's a really, really good character, matter of fact. I think Gwen actually might be my favorite character now that I'm thinking about it. I mean, she is, I can't tell how old she's supposed to be, maybe 10, but she's just this smart mouth, swearing little badass. And she is absolutely not afraid to stand her ground and like tell people to their faces that they're full of shit. So like in that way, she's kind of like a counterpoint to her brother, who is kind of more subdued and fearful, and he desperately wants to intervene when he sees other people being hurt, such as his sister, but he's afraid to. Whereas Gwen, she will absolutely jump right into the mix. Like, her brother's getting beaten up and she jumps right in there, and she gets her ass kicked too by a bunch of boys, which, like I said, totally would have happened in 1978. So it's hard to watch, but it's pretty realistic. So she's absolutely not afraid of getting her ass beat, you know what I mean? And her dad actually usually beats her up specifically for talking about her psychic abilities, because they remind him of his late wife, who apparently also had dreams of this nature, which may have been a factor in her suicide. So obviously he doesn't want to be reminded of that, and it, like, you know, puts him into a rage, so he will like just wail on that little girl, which is like horrible. I mean, there's one scene that's like fairly early on in the movie where Gwen's dad just like whips the fuck out of her, and it's like, it's brutal, and it's like really real, and it's really like upsetting to watch. And I mean, like, the acting work is good all around in this, but Madeline McGraw and Jeremy Davies in that scene are absolutely incredible. I mean, you actually buy that. I mean, I was really uncomfortable it was really uncomfortable for me to watch, because it just seemed like it was so genuine. So the grabber, who, he basically, all they know about him is that he's like an amateur magician, or he like drives a black van or something. So he snatches a few kids off the street, including Finney's friend Robin, who's like the toughest kid in school. Now, Finney is actually really horrified by this, because he figures, hey, if Robin can be taken, who was like the toughest kid in school, then anybody could, you know what I mean? And at this point in the movie, which is about, I want to say it's maybe about halfway through, maybe like a little bit less, after all of this character setup has been done, because you know, like the first 40-45 minutes of the movie is basically like setup of the kids, you know what I mean? You don't really see much of the grabber. It's like you kind of see like the van, and it's like, you know, a kid going like, oh, there's the van over there, and then that kid disappears, and so there's that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of character build up with the kids. So I'm just saying that it's like, don't go into it expecting this to be child killer all the time, because he doesn't show up until like the halfway point. So yeah, about the halfway point, the inevitable happens, and Finney is himself captured by the grabber, who throws him into a yucky basement with only a bed, and there's also like a non-functional black phone title drop hanging on the wall. Now, the grabber's interest in the boys that he takes doesn't seem overtly sexual. Like, he's not a child molester, not in the classic sense, and if I could use that terminology, what a weird way to put it. But in parallel with Finney's own father, the grabber, it seems like, feels the need to punish the children for their transgressions. Like, he's sort of playing a game that he calls Naughty Boy, or like Naughty Boys. In essence, what he'll do is he'll leave like avenues of escape, like kind of obviously open to the boys. And it seems like he does it out of like carelessness, but it's all part of this game. Like, he actually wants the boys to try and escape. He wants them to try and misbehave so he can beat them and kill them, so he can punish them, essentially, and perhaps feel justified in doing so. I felt like that was implicit. They don't really say that. I mean, the grabber is actually never given a backstory. Now, some reviewers liked that and some didn't, because some were like, well, I kind of wish they'd said, you know, what's with the magician thing and why is he doing what he's doing and what's with that. But I tend to fall on the side of liking that his background was kept almost entirely a mystery, because I think it made him creepier. And it made you, as the viewer, have to deal with the killer on the same terms as his victims would, because his victims wouldn't know this motherfucker or nothing like that. So, you know, there was that. So I think it's better, like, that you didn't know anything about why he was doing what he was doing. Like, there were some little hints given as to why the grabber was the way he was. Like, for example, the rotating series of masks that he wears to convey his moods. Those masks were designed by Tom Savini, by the way, which they actually are really, really good. But that's kind of all they are, is hints. And I actually thought this made the movie stronger because, you know, if anybody that's been around here a long time knows, I'm a big advocate of not over-explaining your villain, like, or your monster. Like, it's scarier the less you know about them. Usually, not always, there are exceptions to that, but I think generally it's a good rule to follow. Now, once Finney realizes what's happened, he's been taken by the grabber, he's in this basement, he almost immediately becomes, like, resigned to his fate. Like, he's like, if none of the other boys escaped, like, then what chance do I have, type of thing. But soon enough, the supernatural intervenes. The non-working, ostensibly, a black phone on the wall starts to ring. And when Finney answers it, he starts getting messages from essentially like the ghosts of the boys that have been murdered before him. And they tell him about their own experiences, their own, you know, things that happened to them, like ways they tried to escape, like this worked, this didn't work, like avoid this, doing this, avoid doing that. And they kind of just like give him general advice on how to survive and how to get out of there. Now, meanwhile, while that's all going on, Gwen is deliberately trying to have visions that will save her brother, but for a long time, like, her prayers go unanswered because she's like praying to Jesus. It's kind of like funny, like, it's sad, but it's kind of funny too at the same time. She's like praying to Jesus to like give her, she's like, man, you're giving me all these like visions about like other people, but when it's my brother, like, you can't give me anything. But when she does finally start to have dreams about him, the details are just like really sketchy and it's like really frustrating, but eventually she starts to piece together enough, I guess, like actionable information to take to the cops, and the cops like actually slowly start to take her gift more seriously because she does seem to know what she's talking about and some of her shit like checks out. So as I mentioned, I mean, The Black Phone, it's not the best horror movie ever, and it's not even particularly scary. I mean, it's creepy for sure, but it's not like frightening or like overtly horror like the way maybe Sinister was. But it's a pretty solid dark drama, like with a horror flavor, I guess. Ethan Hawke is really great, like as the grabber. He's very unsettling, he's very menacing, and he's also kind of like socially awkward, which makes him even more creepy, you know what I mean? And he almost never shows his face because he almost always has like a mask or like part of a mask over it, which I think was really cool. The kid actors in this, most of them are phenomenal, and that actually goes a long way toward you kind of getting on their side and like rooting for them to escape and stuff like that. And actually, like the end, like with the reunited, like the brother and sister and everything like that, I kind of like choked up a little bit. It was like really, really well done. And as I mentioned, I feel like the structure of the movie is actually really well considered, like drawing parallels between Finney's abuse at the hands of his dad and his bullies and, you know, his growth toward finding the inner strength necessary to defeat the grabber in the end. So it's kind of like a coming of age story in that way. So like I said, the movie also just kind of looks cool. It has that kind of like dour 70s vibe to it. And it also has, much like Sinister had, it had those kind of like inserts of like Super 8. But in this instance, the Super 8, it's almost kind of used to show Gwen's visions, so it gives it that little bit of like unreality or surreality, which really looks kind of cool. I think probably the only thing I didn't love was the addition of the character of Max. There was nothing wrong with like the actor or anything like that, but I just thought he was a little too over the top, like a little too comic relief kind of. He wasn't in it much, but I could have done without that. But I don't know, it didn't bother me all that much. But I'm gonna say, like, while I liked the movie just fine while I was watching it, but I think like thinking about it afterward gave me a little bit of like a deeper appreciation of the themes that it was putting across and like the way that the plot was constructed. So I think I ended up liking it even more in retrospect than it did while I was watching it, if that makes any sense. So that will do it for this Flickers of Fear. Thank you very much for watching. Remember to like and share, and please comment if you enjoyed the content, and I will see you guys again on the next one. Bye.
And now is acknowledged the presence of the